the last time I spoke in this room for the Carnegie Council was when I was an editorial deputy editor of the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. I was on Fox News all the time. I was clearly affiliated with the right. Times change, as Max also can attest. But you know, I came of age. As I said, I graduated from high school the year the Soviet Union collapsed. But for many years afterwards, in part because of the interests of my late father, I had a kind of an antiquarian interest in the literature of totalitarianism. So I read Hannah Arendt, for instance, when I was in college. I read a lot of the dissident literature that emerged from the Soviet orbit, and it always fascinated me. But I always saw it as a kind of an interesting analysis of a bygone era, of something that happened in the 20s and 30s. You read Darkness at Noon, for example, and you think, how does a guy come to those sorts of conclusions when he's willing to accept the verdict that at some level he knows is untrue, you know, against him, Orwell and so on. One person I read in particular who had a profound impact on me was, and I'm going to mangle his name to any Polish speaker in the room, but Czeslaw Milosz, the Polish Nobel laureate, wrote an amazing book in the 1950s called The Captive Mind. And if you haven't read it, do yourselves a favor, and after you read this book, because it's almost as good, but read Milosz's Captive Mind. One of the things that I thought was very striking was how it understood that the mental byways, the pathways by which his generation of Polish intellectuals coming out of World War II ended up becoming convinced Stalinists. They did not become convinced Stalinists because they were pressured to do so by the regime, because they were living in fear of their lives. They found sort of alibis and excuses for accepting the new Stalinist order as inevitable and in some sense as just. And so it was a much more complicated, the point Milosz was making is that the psychology of authoritarianism, of populism, of totalitarianism is in fact a much more complicated psychology than many of us in the West have typically recognized. A striking feature, and this is the point I want to finish with, a striking feature for me being at the Wall Street Journal's editorial page was suddenly seeing conservative colleagues who a year earlier would never have had anything to do with the kind of politics that were coming to the fore with Trump, the liberalism, the screeching, the coarseness, and so on, suddenly find alibis and excuses for why they could go along with this. Why? Because it was a Manichaean world and Trump was better than Hillary. Or because we had to accept that we were no longer in the post-Cold War era and that Trump was alighting on truths about trade and international relations that rendered all of our previous beliefs about immigration and free trade irrelevant. And it was like reading Milosz in real time. I could point to various figures who I won't name, but you read them in papers too, and you'd say, that's what happens. That's how they move. That's how they come to accept the notion that truth is contingent and history leads inevitably in some kind of dark direction, and you'd better accept it. And so the final point that I want to make is part of the pedagogy of liberty isn't simply understanding what makes the free world strong and robust and why we have to maintain those institutions, but it's to be alert to the kind of dark lure of an authoritarian psychology to which all sorts of people in this country and around the world are succumbing and have succumbed. And if we can arm ourselves intellectually that way, I think we can start to make the kind of inroads for the sake of the world we all want to preserve that so far we haven't been able to achieve.